Ben Carson just lost his cool on live television in a way nobody saw coming, as a usually calm neurosurgeon turned politician exploded at Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett during a heated healthcare debate on CNN, with his voice rising to levels that shocked the entire studio. But what happened next left everyone speechless, because Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. She did not raise her voice. Instead, she delivered a response so cold, so calculated, and so devastating that it instantly went viral across every social media platform. Within hours, number Crockett destroyed was trending worldwide, and Carson's outburst became a meme that defined political discourse. For weeks, the 33-year-old Texas congresswoman was about to show the 72-year-old former housing secretary exactly what happens when you underestimate a young black woman in politics. What she said next did not just silence Carson, it changed the entire conversation about health care in America. The moment was electric. Carson's face turned red with rage, his finger pointed accusingly across the table, and his voice still echoed to the studio from his explosive outburst. The CNN crew stood frozen behind their cameras, unsure whether to keep rolling or cut to commercial, while Anderson Cooper sat between them, his eyes wide with the realization that he was witnessing something that would be replayed for years to come. And then Crockett spoke, her voice calm, controlled, and devastatingly precise, created an immediate contrast that made Carson appear even more unhinged. She did not stand up to match his energy, nor did she raise her voice to compete with his volume. Instead, she did something far more powerful. She spoke directly to the millions of Americans watching at home who were tired of politicians screaming at each other instead of solving real problems. Before we dive deeper into this explosive confrontation, let's acknowledge the atmosphere in that studio, because the lights blazed hot that Tuesday evening. As Anderson Cooper prepared for what was supposed to be a routine healthcare policy discussion, but nothing about this night would turn out routine. The stage was set for a perfect storm. On one side sat Dr. Ben Carson, the 72-year-old former neurosurgeon, who had spent decades saving lives before becoming Trump's housing secretary. Carson had built a reputation as a calm, steady voice of reason, the soft-spoken doctor who could separate conjoined twins and navigate delicate political situations with surgical precision. His supporters saw him as the intellectual conscience of conservative movement, a black conservative who had risen from poverty in Detroit to the highest levels of medicine and government. But lately, Carson had been under immense pressure as his recent comments on health care reform drew criticism from both progressives and conservatives. Some Democrats called his proposals heartless, while even some Republicans questioned whether he was still fighting hard enough for conservative principles. At his age, Carson was starting to feel the weight of defending policies that seemed increasingly out of step with younger Americans, and the pressure had been building for weeks, with his approval ratings dropping. After a poorly received Fox News interview, Carson's critics began to wonder if he had lost the fire to be an effective spokesman for the movement. Some suggested he step away from televised debates and instead focus on behind-the-scenes policy work. Carson's team knew how critical the CNN appearance was, so his chief of staff had spent hours prepping him with talking points and anticipating Crockett's attacks. They rehearsed responses to questions about Medicare, Medicaid, and housing assistance. But there was one thing they had not prepared for, and that was what to do if Carson lost his legendary composure, because for decades his calm demeanor had been his greatest political weapon, and nobody expected it to crack under pressure. Meanwhile, Carson's personal frustrations were also mounting. Friends close to him said he felt increasingly isolated in political circles. Younger conservatives dismissed his experience, and older establishment Republicans treated him like a relic from a different era, leaving him caught between two worlds. Across the table sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a 33-year-old rising star from Texas, and one of the most formidable voices in the Democratic Party, a former criminal defense attorney and civil rights lawyer. Crockett had earned her law degree from the University of Houston and had made her mark defending the underserved in Dallas County. When she entered Congress in 2023, she did not come to make friends. She came to make change, and she had quickly gained attention for her sharp questioning during committee hearings and her ability to cut through political spin. Her supporters saw her as the future of the Democratic Party, while her critics dismissed her as another radical progressive. But everyone agreed she was not someone to underestimate, especially in a debate. Her preparation was legendary, as her staff would confirm, because before major appearances, she would spend days memorizing statistics, rehearsing responses, and absorbing every possible angle of the issue at hand, more than that she understood the human stories behind the numbers. Just 3 days before her CNN appearance, Crockett had visited a community health center in her district where she met Maria. Santos, a 34-year-old mother of two who had been rationing insulin due to its cost. And to Crockett, this story was not just debate fodder. It was the very reason she was in politics. Her team had also compiled a deep research file on Carson's tenure as housing secretary, complete with internal HUD documents and contradictions between his public statements and actual department actions. This was not personal, it was. Accountability. The healthcare debate had been intensifying for months. Carson was defending the Republican plan, which proposed significant Medicaid cuts and Medicare changes critics said would devastate working families. Crockett had emerged as a leading voice against these proposals, arguing that they would especially harm communities of color and low-income Americans who relied on such programs for basic care. The stakes were personal for both of them, because Carson's own mother had once relied on government, a fact that made his current position especially controversial, with critics calling it betrayal and supporters insisting he understood the need for reform better than anyone. For Carson, defending these policies was about his beliefs in personal responsibility and limited government, while for Crockett, it was about her constituents, many of whom had been devastated by hospital closures and lack of access to care. She had campaigned on expanding Medicaid and strengthening Medicare, and her victory over three more established candidates was due in large part to that grassroots promise. Tonight's debate was meant to give each side a chance to make their case to the American public, but tensions have been simmering long before they ever sat down on CNN. Carson had recently dismissed Crockett's healthcare proposals as unrealistic fantasies, showing her inexperience, and she had fired back, saying he was out of touch with American families struggling to afford basic care with midterms approaching and millions of voters watching. This moment had the potential to change the political landscape. Anderson Cooper introduced both guests, and the tension in the studio was undeniable. Carson sat stiffly in his chair, showing early signs of irritation. Proposing his fiscal responsibility. We cannot keep spending money we do not have on programs that are already unsustainable. These are not cuts. They are smart reforms that will make Medicare more efficient. That is when Crockett leaned forward, her eyes narrowing, and said, Dr. Carson, with all due respect, smart reforms is just political speak for taking health care away from the people who need it most. You are talking about efficiency. While families in my district are rationing insulin because they cannot afford it, Carson's jaw tightened slightly, and he responded, Congresswoman, I have spent my entire career actually helping people, not just talking about it. I have saved thousands of lives with these hands. I understand health care in ways someone with less experience might not grasp. The condescension was clear, but Crockett kept her composure and said, Dr. Carson, performing surgery and crafting healthcare policy are two very different things. Being a doctor does not automatically make you an expert on healthcare policy. Carson's voice rose slightly for the first time, and he replied, I think 30 years of medical practice gives me more credibility than someone who has been in Congress for less than 2 years. As Cooper tried to redirect the conversation toward policy specifics, Carson was not finished, and the explosion that followed would become the most replayed political moment in recent history. The problem with young politicians today is they think passion can replace experience. They think that because they can deliver a good speech, they understand complex policy issues that have been debated for decades. Crockett's eyebrows raised slightly, but her voice remained ice cold as she asked, Dr. Carson, are you suggesting that young people, particularly young women of color, don't have the intellectual capacity to understand healthcare policy? Carson's voice grew louder as he replied, I'm not making this about race or gender. I'm talking about experience versus inexperience. I'm talking about people who've actually done the work versus people who just talk about the work. Crockett repeated his phrase, the work, with a sharper tone. Dr. Carson, what work exactly did you do as housing secretary to help with health care? Because from where I'm sitting, your department's budget cuts actually made housing less affordable for families who then had to choose between rent and medical care. Carson's face flushed red as he responded, that's a gross mischaracterization of our policies, and frankly, it shows exactly the kind of political grandstanding I'm talking about. Crockett fired back. It's not grandstanding when it's based on your department's own data, as she pulled a folder from beside her chair and said data that shows housing assistance was cut by 18% under your leadership, forcing families to make impossible choices. I have the HUD reports right here. Dr. Carson, would you like me to read the exact numbers? The fact that she had come prepared with documentation while Carson was relying on talking points wasn't lost on anyone watching, and viewers at home could clearly see the difference between someone who had done their homework and someone who expected their reputation To carry the argument, the tension in the studio was now palpable. Camera operators zoomed in on both faces. Carson's, growing redder by the second. Crockett's, remaining perfectly composed, but with steel in her eyes. Carson leaned forward aggressively, saying, "Congresswoman, you can throw around statistics all you want, but you don't understand the real world. You don't understand what it takes to actually implement policy. You think everything is simple when you're sitting in your ivory tower, making speeches." Crockett's voice remained steady, but there was danger in her tone now as she replied, "Ivory tower. Dr. Carson, I grew up in a family where my grandmother had to choose between her heart medication and her rent. I worked my way through law school while holding down 2 jobs I represented. Families who lost their homes because of medical debt. What ivory tower are you talking about?" Carson was visibly frustrated, now his calm facade completely cracked. He said, "Look, I've heard all the sob stories, I've heard all the emotional appeals, but governing requires more than just feeling bad about problems. It requires understanding complex systems, understanding economics, understanding." Crockett cut in her voice like a blade. "Understanding what it's like to actually live paycheck to paycheck. Understanding what it's like to wonder if you can afford your child's asthma inhaler, because I do understand that Dr. Carson question is to you." That was when Carson completely lost control. His voice exploded across the studio as he shouted, "Don't you dare lecture me about poverty. I grew up with nothing. My mother cleaned houses while I was studying to become a brain surgeon. I've done more to lift people out of poverty than you'll do in your entire career." The studio fell silent. Even the camera operator seemed stunned. Anderson Cooper's eyes widened as Carson continued shouting, "You think you know struggle? You think you understand what it takes? I performed miracles in operating rooms while you were still in law school. I've saved children's lives. I've given families hope when there was none. And now some freshman congresswoman wants to lecture me about helping people." Carson was standing now, pointing at Crockett, his face bright red and spittle flying as he screamed, "I am tired of young politicians who think they know everything, tired of being talked down by people who haven't accomplished a fraction of what I have." The silence that followed was deafening. The entire CNN newsroom seemed to stop breathing. Carson stood there, chest heaving, realizing too late that he had just exploded on national television in a way that would haunt him forever. And through it all, Jasmine Crockett hadn't moved. She sat perfectly still, her expression unchanged, watching Carson's meltdown with the calm of someone who had seen this kind of outburst before. What she said next would make history. The studio remained frozen in stunned silence. Carson stood there, breathing heavily, his outburst hanging in the air like smoke after an explosion. Anderson Cooper looked between both guests, clearly unsure how to proceed. The CNN crew behind the cameras exchanged shocked glances, and then Jasmine Crockett spoke, her voice so calm, so measured, so utterly controlled that it created an even starker contrast to Carson's explosion. She didn't stand up. She didn't raise her voice. She simply looked directly into the camera and began speaking with the precision of a surgeon, herself a surgeon, cutting through political pretense with surgical accuracy. "Dr. Carson," she began, her tone almost conversational, "I want to thank you for that demonstration, because you just proved everything that's wrong with how this country discusses health care policy." Carson started to sit back down, his face still flushed, clearly realizing his mistake. But Crockett wasn't finished. "You just spent 3 minutes screaming at me about your accomplishments, your surgeries, your rise from poverty, your miracle operations, and not one single word about the millions of Americans who can't afford to see a doctor." In the first place, the camera stayed tight on her face as she continued, her voice never wavering. "You want to talk about experience? Let me tell you about experience. In the last month alone, I've met with families in my district who are rationing insulin, not because insulin